I recently watched a video by Uncle Tony's Garage entitled "The Single Most Misused Item in the World of Cars." It's basically a wire splicing video, and since there's clearly not enough wire splicing videos on YouTube, I decided to make my own. Strolled on over to Home Depot, picked up some butt splices and some shrink tubing. Everything most people would have when they're doing some splices. So I'll show you my thoughts on this. So, is there anything wrong with the butt splice? I don't know. I'm no expert, so I don't know if I'd say that, but I can tell you it's something that I haven't used in a very long time. So in Uncle Tony's video, he demonstrated that you can easily pull the wire out of the butt splice and that you are not using it correctly if you're not using heat shrink tubing. So to start, I suppose we should talk about the heat shrink tubing. This is your standard single wall 2-to-1 shrink ratio tubing. You can pretty much get it everywhere. By the parts store, it comes on a roll. Buy it at Home Depot, it comes in a little bag of whatever sorted sizes you need. This is the 1/4-inch tubing. It's 2-to-1, so it'll go half to its size. So it's 1/4 inch, it'll go to 1/8. If you get 1/2 inch, it'll go down to 1/4. If you get 1 inch, it'll go down to 1/2 inch. Pretty straightforward. 1/8 to a 1/16, which I think we have an 1/8 in here as well. 1/8 and a 3/16. 1/8, 3/16 and 1/4. So basically what we have. Butt splices and most splices, ring terminals, flag terminals, spade connectors, everything pretty much comes with red, blue, or yellow insulations. Red being small, blue being medium, yellow being large. We'll try the red here first. I have an assortment of wire, so let's go with the 16 gauge. That's pretty common in cars, although so is the 20 gauge I have there as well. So if you've never done one of these, which I'm sure you have, everybody has at some point, you splice the old wire, put it on in there, use your crimpers, and give it a crimp. And that's it. Pretty sturdy, I'd say. Strip the other side. Twist. And put it in there. So, that is a pretty good splice. If you notice though, I'm using the South Wire crimper. We have a little different jaw profile than what's typically used in your one tool universal, and that is the way it closes. It's just better. If the writing was still on here, you would see that this cavity, the bottom one, would say insulated, and this little V groove cavity would say non-insulated. It's going to be important. Anyway, you're not pulling that out of there. So that is a good crimp. In Uncle Tony's video, he pulled it out of there. Now, he's probably been tugging on wires a lot longer than I have. But yeah, that is a good crimp. So to finish it off, my scissors. See about how long we need a shrink tubing. Slide it in there. Heat up the shrink tubing. If you're new to wire splicing, you're probably using a lighter here. The internet will tell you not to. I will say, who cares, use whatever you have. And there is our splice. Pretty straightforward. Now, my issue with it is it's bulky, because the shrink tubing, it makes it look better than the butt splice, but it still shows the actual splice, and it's big. Let's see if I can get you a better idea of its size, which isn't that bad, but it's still not small. I would say, looking at this, it is better than seeing the butt splice in there, that you took the time and effort and cost of putting a heat shrink tubing over your splice. But it's not the best still, because if you can see, we aren't quite sealed. Just a little bit. Can still get in there, because you can probably see it now. Because the shrink tubing can't shrink small enough. So it's not bad, but it's not that good. It would last you probably years on the back of your trailer, keep the lights working for a long time, I'm sure of it. But it could be better. Allow me to demonstrate. Well, let me back up. You could say use a smaller piece of tubing. Well, keep in mind our multi-pack comes with 3 sizes, 1/4 inch, which I use first, and then the 3/16 and the 1/8. This is the 1/8. We want the 3/16. 3/16 can't fit. I guess you could if you forced it. But realistically, it can't really fit over the smallest butt splice. So that's basically as good as we're getting right there. Now, that is basically a tube with red insulation around it. That little thing is called a non-insulated butt splice. That is what they look like. Pretty small, pretty simple. Years ago, you could stroll down to the old Radio Shack, pick up a bag of 50 of them for, I think it was like $3. Pretty cheap. You get a whole bunch of them, and it does a little better job. Allow me to demonstrate. Also, just so you know, I'm using the non-insulated crimper now, the one little V groove on my tool. Just as strong, because it's the same thing as the tube that was inside the red thing, only with the insulation coming off. So now we can use the smaller diameter shrink tubing. Heat it up with our lighter or our heat gun. And now we have a splice with a much lower profile than before. Takes up much less room. Doesn't look quite as bad. It still looks like there's something weird going on inside of there, but it is a little bit better. The other thing that we have going for us is our tubing is now fully sealed over our wire. So we have a better watertight seal than we did before and less room. So that, I think, is the ideal way to do it if you're just starting out, if you will. Use non-insulated butt splices. And they're available in a few different ways. You can order them on the internet. Pop them out of the connector like I just did. A lot of different things you could do. The downfall now is our original splice. We could sit here and rub this on this piece of wood to our heart's desire, and it's going to take a lot of rubbing to pierce through that insulation. As you can see, I did it, but I'm not there yet. So let's pretend my stir stick here is, the frame of a car, or maybe the inner fender of a car, and this wire is just rubbing on the corner of that metal. It'll get worn down and it'll short out. But you saw how much rubbing I had to do that? Quite a bit. With our non-insulated, now we're just relying on the shrink tubing to do our insulating. And I've already worn down. So it's not necessarily always the best place to do it. But I would say it's a better looking splice still. Let's recreate our first splice again. So thus far, our problem really lies with the shrink tubing. Again, this is a standard wall, or thin wall, or whatever you want to call it, 2-to-1 shrink ratio. Let's go ahead and get rid of this and never look at it again. What I have here is a piece of double wall adhesive lined shrink tubing in 1/4 inch. This is still a 2-to-1 shrink ratio, I think, but it is available in 4-to-1, 3-to-1, I think even 8-to-1 on larger sizes. It's a little harder to slip in because of that adhesive lining, but it goes still. Let's heat it up. Lighter isn't easy here now because we need to heat it up just a pinch longer. And by then your hand starts cramping up, your lighter starts overheating, all kinds of different things. Alright, this one has cooled down now, so let me show you the difference. It being a thicker wall, in my opinion, it holds the wire better. It just looks straight, it looks nice. Why aren't you focusing, you camera? I think it's just a better looking splice if you're going to use a butt splice. Also, because of our adhesive lining, we have the same shrink ratio, but we have the, I don't know what it is, I think it's like hot glue inside, that is now glued itself to the wire and started seeping out the end, sealing it up tight. So you have much better splice, better waterproof ability. If you're going to put this on a trailer, it'll probably last you until the wire just wears right through or rots away. This will last you a long, long time. Can you still rub through it? I'm sure you could. Not yet. All right, now we're down to the red. So little harder to rub through than the single wall, but for the most part, this stuff isn't really rub through proof. It's just better. So I would have tried to avoid putting a splice near something sharp anyway, but you know, at least you have some better protection with this. Now we do still have the bulkiness of the actual splice itself. So let's get rid of this insulation off this splice. So now we have the splice without the insulation, so it's the non-insulated butt splice, and we have a much narrower profile on the wire. Anybody looking at this isn't going to know if it's a butt splice or something else going on inside of here. It takes up less room as well, so it's kind of a win-win all the way around. I think if you're going to do random splices, a non-insulated with the adhesive line dual wall shrink tubing will be your best bet, especially given the cost. Once you order yourself a bundle of the non-insulated splices and a 4-foot stick or reel of the adhesive line dual wall tubing, you'll be set for a long time. That is a good splice that's going to last, like I said, until the wire deteriorates away. Good stuff. But we've been working on a 16 gauge wire. Modern electronics, they sure don't use a 16 anymore. They do something much, much smaller. Here we have a 20 gauge. A tiny little wire. Even if we use the non-insulated splice, it's a huge splice for such a tiny wire. So we can even improve our game further if we're doing something this small, because that's pretty huge. And actually, looking back on it now, I should have used blue wire instead of red with the red splice. That's fine. Another benefit to using the non-insulated splice is, let's say you crimped it along the seam of the barrel, or crimped it too many times or in the wrong spot, and it kind of opened up like that and you're questioning it. Now that you don't have insulation on there, you have the ability to solder it, which you'll never have on the insulated splice. So let's tin our wire here, get the heat transfer going. And we can put a little dabble in there, a little dabble there. And we're done. in case you're wondering why I smacked it on the tube, it's in case there's a dribble or solder or anything that impact, we'll leave it onto my little pine stir stick here and keep the solder from globbing onto the splice itself. So now we have a soldered splice, which, I mean, soldering has its ups and downs. Its biggest problem is we can't really flex anymore because the solder has now wicked into the end of the wires. So if you're in a high bend or high vibration scenario, that would kind of be a problem. Okay, now let's talk about the red splice again, because we haven't done that enough. This red splice is for a 22 to a 16 gauge. If you notice on my 16 gauge wire, it seemed like there was a lot of space left over in that little barrel. See what I mean? Like, you can't, but you know, there are some empty voids in there. See if you can see it. There you go. See what I mean? Like, it's not quite filling the barrel as well as you'd think it would. So if we go any smaller, we're gonna have a whole lot of open air to where we almost have to solder it just to make sure it stays put. But there is another alternative, and that is we upgrade our splices. This is a TE Connectivity 800 series splice. It's a pretty good splice. It comes on a spool, at least this one does. Comes in I bought it as a spool is 2,500. If you were going to buy one, that's what you would get. That tiny little thing right there. You see it? Let me see if I can zoom in. See? Tiny, tiny little splice. What it does is you would need special crimpers for it, of course. To these, if you see the profile of that crimp, kind of looks like a bee, if you will. Anywho, so what it does is as you close the wings right there, let me zoom out. As those wings close with that crimper, it folds it in on itself and really holds onto that wire. That's what we need to do. This crimper, I think is $100. This is a wide range. They are available much cheaper than that from a aftermarket supplier. This is a Delphi. I do not know the part number. It used to be on that label, but so old. Pretty worn down. Also, I lost the center pin, so I now have replacement pins taped on there, and they're still working fine. I wouldn't buy those if I were you. I would buy something else. Those are a little costly for what they do. So, how do we use that to there? Well, it's supposed to be in a machine, a crimp splice. Let me see if I have one. So here's our press applicator. This die is for a pair of relay connectors. So what you would have here is this into a press, and it comes and punches down and crimps everything for you. As it comes down and crimps, it also, first you would feed your strip into here. So it comes out there. You put your wire in the front. This would be sideways. This is a mock-up. This comes down, crimps your wire, goes back up, and it cuts it off as you go. So you basically put your wire in there, 2 or 1 or whatever you're doing, and it would crimp, 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 a couple hundred an hour. But we're not here to talk about press applicators. We're talking hand tools today. How I would do this is not use 1, but use 3. So I would put the first wire in like so. Now, if you had one of those little helping hands, I think they call them, which is a little thing with alligator clips to hold it for you, you could just do 1. But I also like doing 3 for many reasons. So I'm going to put it in there, crimp it, and now my insulation is crimped onto the first splice. I'll get the second one, put it in there, put it in the small crimp cavity, give it a little pinch, And now our insulation is being supported by our new little splice. And now I'll come back and do the middle. Give it a little push. And that is what we are left with. Doesn't look that good in the camera, especially zoomed in, but looking at it in person, that's a pretty perfect crimp. And now, if we felt so inclined, we could solder it too. Now we have a halfway decently soldered splice, which is not noticeably any bigger than the actual wire. Now we can actually use our smaller 3/16 tubing, or 8th, or whatever size this is. And with the heat shrink tubing applied, you can see that it doesn't really take up much room at all. If you're doing an entire harness, this would be ideal. The little bit of space that the non-insulated butt splice takes up quite adds up when you start getting 7 or 8 wires inside one loom. That's where this would shine. And even then you stagger these and it makes for a pretty good repair. So that's called an open barrel crimp splice. It, I think, is ideal. Every time I need to splice a wire, this is the way I do it, combined with the dual wall adhesive line shrink tubing, and you have an excellent splice. And you can start getting all kinds of fun stuff going on when you start getting into that type of splice. So let's grab 2 14 gauge wires and splice those together. Let's say in our hypothetical here that we are splicing in a light to put onto the front grille of our truck. Gonna make it look like a Mustang with the 2 headlights in the grille. So yeah, let's do that. But let's say we also want an indicator light coming off there so we know when they're on, because you can't actually see the difference. So while we're splicing this, let's put something else inside of there. So let's crimp these 2 14s together, and we'll tie in the 16 on the other side just for our indicator bulb that we're adding in. If you notice that followed right out of there, yeah, well, you need a bunch of hands to be able to start doing this, but once you do a couple hundred of them, you start getting pretty good at it. And there is our splice with 2 14s coming together with a 16 tailing off to the side. Let's throw some double wall adhesive lined in there. And there is our splice slash 16 gauge Y coming off it. Pretty interesting. It's it may not be something you always need to do, but it's handy when you do. Usually when you see this kind of bundle, it's usually for a ground setup to where you have 1 ground wire and then it just goes off to 4 other ground wires. That's when you start seeing that kind of splice used. Now, the heat shrink tubing isn't necessarily only used for insulating or waterproofing. It's also used as a strain relief. So the crimp, obviously there's going to be some strain on there because you're holding onto those bare copper wires, and when the wires move around, it's going to start to wear away those copper and eventually just cut or ruin your crimp. So the heat shrink tubing acts as a strain relief, if you will. So when you bend this, it's not really bending at the crimp anymore. This is now kind of taking up some of the room of the splice. It's kind of the same way an extension cord would work. So you have these grooves. If this extension cord wasn't 50 years old, it might still be a little flexible, but those little grooves it's strain relief. So you have your crimps here where our wire goes, And if it bends at that point, it'll break. But if it keeps the bending over here, over on the strain relief, it's not going to break internally. So the shrink tubing is important for many reasons. Strain relief, waterproofing, and insulating. So now that we've talked about theory a little bit, let's talk about practice. Let's say we have a drill that got a little too close to the old grinder. And we did a good little cut on the wires. We have two wires. At a glance, it looks like 16 and 14 gauge wire and two, so no ground, which can be confirmed with the plug. So we need to cut this wire off and fix this. So let's go ahead and do that. So here's our cord that needs repairing. I'll probably leave these cotton strands in there just to take up some room. As we're only doing 2 splices on this cord, I'm not going to bother staggering the splices because it's a pretty thick cord and there's not much going on there. I should have plenty of room. So I am going to use my adhesive line shrink tubing, and these little 3 guys should work out perfectly on this. The wire should be just the right size for the conductor, but I think on the insulation crimp it's going to be a little tight, but it should still hold it for me. Yeah, it's going to be a little tight. If I had, this is an 800 series, if I had a 600 series splice, it'd probably be perfect, but I don't. So we'll use that. However, we do have another splice I could use as well. These are Delphi open barrel crimp splices, but they have an internal little knurling to give it better grip onto the copper. So I think I'm going to be using these since these won't really fit on the insulation. Although they might. I haven't decided yet. We'll see where this goes once I get the wire stripped. They fit fine. So let's roll with that. Now, because I'm doing such a small area, I gotta use my shrink tubing wisely. I can't go too far. I don't want to go very big. I could probably do it there, but a little shorter would probably be ideal. So I'll go right there. So I'll get 2 of those to cover up my crimps. And then I'm going to use the larger stuff for the actual tube itself. And we're going to go pretty big with this. And I'm going to do 2 of those, and you'll see why shortly. Now, since this is actually a repair, won't be able to slip this over the drill, so I need to put it on first, along with the second one. Now for these guys, which will sit right there and give me just enough room to get the crimpers in there and crimp those. And that was all blurry. So, put those over there. Gave me just enough room. Let me see if I can zoom in a little for you. Alright, strip down the other side, and I will get those crimped on there. Alright, both crimps are made. Pretty easy to do. Once you get it started anyway. Getting it started, I think, is kind of the challenge. Just because you don't have 3 or 4 hands to hold it for you. So these aren't good necessarily always, but as far as your quality of your crimp splice, but as far as the quality of your splice goes, that's where these shine. If somebody looks at your work, it won't look like an amateur did it. It'll look like somebody with some experience went in there, spliced it back together. Which, if you're going to make a repair, the less noticeable it is, the better. You're always going to be able to see a repair, of course, but, you know. Alright, so, this is where the fun part is. I want to put a piece of tubing from here to here to fill in the area that I just worked on. So what I'm doing I'm gonna slide it over, cotton strands and all. Cotton string, I don't know what you'd call it. Gonna twist her in there. So I'll go right there to the edge. Use my finger. Right there is where the wire starts. So ever so carefully, cut it right there. There. So this will pick up where the outer sheathing of the wire was. That should space it out better. Stuff gets hot. Now I can put this over. And do it again. So, it's about dry. It's still a little warm, so it's still a little flexible, but for the most part, it's not bad. You can see a little bulge here where the two splices were. If I staggered them, you probably wouldn't notice that little bulge. However, your splice wouldn't be, inch and a half long. It'd be like 3 inches, from here to here, because you need more room to work. But for the most part, that's a good repair. It's not too bad. Somebody looks at it, they're going to know it was repaired, but they're not going to think that it was done oddly. It looks like it was done correctly. But more importantly, still works. I next spent another 30 minutes or so explaining how I spliced in this 8-conductor cable back together. The problem is it was just too long, and this video's gone on for long enough. You should get the gist. So that's kind of how I do most of my splices. Most of the time it's field splices like that. That's where these crimpers come in. They're really for field repairs. They're not necessarily for production use. That's where those crimp applicators you saw come into play in a press. So most of the time it's field work, and this is perfect for field work. It works, it'll last, and you won't have any issues with it. May not look the best, but it works. And that's, at the end of the day, that's what matters. So, yeah, I hope you liked my video. I know it went on for far too long, and I probably covered too much stuff too many times. But I see a lot of splicing videos out there where it's just, here's your butt splice, have fun, and I just don't care for them. I want to see better quality splice. I want to see that adhesive line string tubing. So that's it. Hope you enjoyed. I'll see y'all later.